Metal Gear Solid! This series is a clusterfuck. Seriously, you've got like 30-something products spanning across 3 decades that landed these games from consoles to cell phones. It's huge. There's Metal Gear interactive novels, and Metal Gear scholastic novels, and Metal Gear visual novels. All things considered, it's a total corporate milk tank of a franchise that would make even Nintendo mascots jealous. So I'm pretty surprised that I impulse purchased this HD collection on a whim, because I'm usually pretty stingy about game purchases, and I've also played through the main ones at some point or another, but these games were some of my favorites growing up, and it's probably because they managed to do the whole franchise continuity thing a lot better than most IPs. Each game isn't a remake or reboot of one another, but an actually concise chunk of one longer story that took a good 20 years of constant development to tell. It's one of those franchises that's meant to be played as a whole, and it's not hard to do that. The fairly new Huldolf collection puts most of the series on one disc for Xbox and triples, and a good chunk of the games had a PC release as well. Chances are that anyone who plays games has access to one of these things, and since I have most of them all in one place, I'm going to try to go through the main series one more time and attempt to find out what made them stick. Now bear with me for a while, this might take some time, kinda like watching your way through one of these games. The crazy Japanese scamp behind this series has no filter and no editor, and that's what's distinct about it. Hideo Kojima is a rare example of a gaming auteur who has a multi-million-dollar budget to work with, so these games contain some of the most exciting examples of authorship in the medium. Though Metal Gear games are often derided for being more movie than game, that's hardly a misplaced criticism. When Kojima gets a hold of a script, he just doesn't want to shut up, so it was with some surprise that I found out that the very first Metal Gear game from 1987 actually has a sense of brevity. And that's Metal Gear 1, by the way, not Metal Gear Solid 1. They started naming these games weird after they made 3 of them. But seriously, dialogue in this game begins and ends in a snap. It's almost jarring. Everyone just wants to shut up before they even begin talking. You see some new boss and make a call back home and it's all like, "This is Solid Snake, over. Hello, this is Diane. Hind D must be destroyed by grenade launcher, bye." Though the game has the usual large cast of supporting characters, their conversations are over in a heartbeat. They aren't particularly fleshy characters either. Take a look at this guy. It's Gray Fox! The backstory says that he's the veteran badass of Foxhound, which is your dude's military unit. He's a major character of the series and sticks around for the next 2 games even after a few fake deaths. The whole canology plays this dude up like he's a tragic superhero, so if he's in over his head, you must be in for some serious shit, right? Well, once you do rescue him, he tells you 3 lines about Metal Gear that you'd already know from the manual, and then he just disappears and is never heard from again. Future games wouldn't dare leave something like this hanging without some kind of overblown drama. The first game doesn't go on and on about shocking twists and lengthy backstories, and having to sit through overblown theatrics is like the defining feature of the series. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Despite being uncharacteristically shy, this game resembles its successors more than you'd expect. First and foremost, it's a sneaking game. This was accomplished by the same mechanics that define stealth games today. The most obvious one is that your character is pretty gimpy compared to other action heroes. He can take only a few hits and moves very slowly. You don't start with any weapons at all, and once you do find a gun, he's pretty bad at shooting. He's actually worse than the guards you're up against, but you have a big arsenal of more indirect weapons like mines and timed explosives. Lining up a good first shot or ambushing enemies around corners is a more feasible combat strategy than straight-up gunfights. Also, your dude is unrealistically hard to detect. These sneaking logistics are impossible. Guards are completely oblivious to your presence unless you cross their line of sight, which is a far cry from the usual action game enemies that magically know where you are at all times. They also walk in short, repeated patrol patterns. All things considered, your character is better equipped for stealth than combat. Get spotted and respawning guards start spilling out of the woodwork. You're up against overwhelming odds, but have the edge if you just give the game some patience. When you throw all of these mechanics together, you have a white-knuckle and high-tension military-theme action game that actually discourages combat, and that probably blew everyone's mind back in the day. These genre elements remained for decades in almost everything from Hitman to Amnesia, and Metal Gear progenited them all at once back in 1987. What's also cool about this old-ass game is that it progresses much smoother and faster than other games of its time, which is funny because the core gameplay itself is really slow and methodical. You go through this claustrophobic military facility at a really brisk, satisfying pace. In the beginning of the game, you don't know where to go and what to do, and all these guards are kicking your ass, but just a few hours later you're blowing up tanks and helicopters and parachuting off buildings like a quieter, more introverted Rambo. You do a lot of backtracking for keycards and non-combat items that might as well be keycards. After making your way through just a few sets of locked doors, this big complex suddenly feels a lot smaller and familiar. And this has a lot to do with that overrated underdog of game making: level design! Note how when you first enter Outer Heaven, you immediately see 3 branching pathways. The first you see leads to a locked door, the second leads to a dead end. but these false starts are very much worth the trip. For starters, you've got infinite rations to make it worth your time. There's also binoculars and a visual clue that there's another side of the building that you'll be exploring later. But in one of those trucks at the dead end is a keycard. Maybe you use it on that first locked door you saw earlier. Oh, look at that, it worked, and there was a gas mask inside. After going back to try out the third branch, you get a gun and a few landmines, and then make it to an elevator where you go to the only floor it goes to, and hey, look at that! Now you gotta use that gas mask. It's a bit refreshing to see level design drive a game forward, and especially in a series that's a bit more narrative-driven.
Press the select button.
For the first few hours, this game has some really cleverly designed spaces. You're quietly funneled in the right direction of what looks like a complicated maze, and it's got a real sense of progression because of this. It's a good deal friendlier than other 80s games.
Where do I go? What do I do?
Plus, there's some rare examples of early set-piece moments that turn it all into a real blockbuster of a production. Like so many other great action games, Metal Gear has one of those moments where you get captured and lose all your stuff, and suddenly you have to rethink game strategies that you got used to hours earlier. I love that shit. Plus, you keep bumping into bosses at a fairly fast pace. They do that thing where they stop the game and say something like, "Mwahaha, I am the shot maker, I make the best shots." And then they just blow up. And the game just quickly moves on to the next section. These bosses don't give a dying 10-minute monologue about their sympathetic motives and tragic backstories. Hell no! Metal Gear 1 doesn't give a shit about story and context. It just blows stuff up and lets you get on with your life. Brevity! And for the first few hours, it's great. The game's backtracky levels and stealthy mechanics afford it much more deliberate pacing and spatial complexity than, say, Operation Wolf, or even Contra. And guess what? This is what the series stayed like 10 years later. In Metal Gear Solid, you gotta collect key cards and regularly backtrack for sniper rifles and stuff, and the whole game is made out of really small maps. And you know what other thing I really love about Metal Gear 1? It's this little submachine gun. It has an honest-to-God working spray radius on a 2D plane. You can camp around corners with it and spray and pray when shit gets bad. It eats up ammo real fast and has terrible range. It's the same SMG mechanics that didn't translate well into 3D until like Counter-Strike. Using it is the kind of tactical decision that you just don't find in other 80s shooters. Look at that, that's awesome! It's a real shame that this game didn't get the audience it deserves, and it's funny to say that because it's such a huge franchise, but the version that I'm playing now actually isn't what most Americans were playing back in the 1980s. Metal Gear 1 originally came out for the MSX2 gaming computer, and the MSX was like the Xbox of the 80s. It was a region-specific TV computer that was competing with consoles from Nintendo, Sega, and Atari. It never really had a big sales push in America and was a bit underpowered compared to other systems of the time. So when Kojima inherited an action-shooting game project, he found that the system simply couldn't handle throwing around too many enemies and bullets onto screens that couldn't scroll. The solution? Make it a sneaking game instead of a shooting game. Europe got a hilariously translated version of Metal Gear, and America got an NES port that was hardly faithful to the original. It's got so much more abstract level design, and the final boss isn't Metal Gear, and for some reason they changed it so that the villain was written in as Colonel Vermin Katafi, a riff on the late Muammar al-Gaddafi, who stirred up an American anti-Arab hate machine during the Reagan administration. There's also this Commander South character, who's a play on Oliver North, a famous figure from the scandal that Contra got its name from. Point is, the NES version botched it up so bad that it has its own AVGN episode.
It's terrible, and yeah, I know it's a classic game, but when something's fucked up, it's fucked up.
The NES version is also notable that it tried to make Metal Gear all political for some reason. Even though the story behind the original game has a military theme and takes place in Africa, it doesn't really drop names or use real-life references. Take note, this is important. This shit's confusing, but the NES version isn't considered canon anyway, so it's not like it matters. However, that didn't stop it from selling well enough in the American market to warrant an NES sequel that then inspired a house-made MSX sequel that came out for it later. The NES version even got Commodore and MS-DOS ports, but nowadays a remastered and retranslated version of the MSX version is floating around on the Subsistence re-release in the HD collection, so it's probably circulating around on enough discs nowadays to be easier to find than the original NES cartridge. I don't fucking know. Point is, this version lived and the other one died. Be all nostalgic about it, I guess, but I don't fucking know, this is stupid. Why? So back in the MSX version, meticulous pacing and careful level design really drive the first few hours forward pretty well. You don't need the manual to know how to play it, and most of the weird looking stuff gets explained away by these codec calls. But then you start to ride up and down a few floors. There's locked doors everywhere. There's a few more buildings to explore with outdoor sections in between. You start getting tempted to make paper maps, and then something like this will happen. Fuck, how was I supposed to know to blow that up? So a few annoying 80s quirks start to show about halfway through. One thing that really started getting on my nerves was how you have to scroll through every keycard you have in front of every locked door. I just have to stand in front of every door and go through them all until I hit the right one. And these doors aren't laid out with a logical sense of progression. You'd think that a level 5 card is called level 5 because it's greater in some quality than the level 4 card. But it's not. It just unlocks a few particular doors that the level 4 and level 6 cards don't. Like, dude, here's a door just before the final boss of the game, and it's behind a level 1 door, which is behind a level 9 door. Here's a room in the very beginning of the game that's behind a level 1 door, which is behind a level 2 door. This is a time sink. Why did they build the game like this? Oh, look at this asshole, taking advantage of the fact, just running into me while I cycle through all these keycards. Fuck, I can't fight back. He's immune to everything, and he just zips over here at a rate faster than I can run away. Oh god, this elevator only goes up. And oh god, this elevator only goes down. To run across the entire roof level and backtrack up the basement just to go down one floor. I forgot to grab the scorpion antidote an hour earlier, and I gotta go all the way back to the daughter in the basement of building 1 at the beginning of the game, and then go back to the doctor in building 2, and...
I just want to know what to do. Where do I go? What do I do?
Also, there are these trapdoors that collapse underneath you, usually after you've moved past the point of no return. They don't appear often, but you have no way to plan for them, and they just turn parts of the game into a frustrating trial and error exercise. Fuck! Okay, so there's also this leveling up system where you become a badder dude for rescuing the hostages. Every 5 hostage is a new star on your wanted meter, and every new star means that you get more health and more ammo. And this is cool. By the time you're up to 4 stars, you're this semi-invincible legendary mercenary who can handle way more shit than you could earlier. And it really helps reinforce that sense of pacing and progression. Snake actually levels up along with you as you climb the difficulty curve. But then there's this boss towards the end of the game who's in a room full of hostages. If you hit 1, you lose a star. It doesn't give you a warning about it. I hit a hostage without even knowing he was there, and I didn't notice that I lost a star when it happened. Since the game didn't make a fuss about it, I just moved on and kept going to the final boss where, as it turns out, you need 4 stars down there to beat him. You literally can't carry enough ammo to destroy Metal Gear unless you didn't hit that guy way earlier. I mean, during the fight you get a call from this unseen Jennifer chick who tells you that she won't help you anymore if you hit one, but it's not like she warns you that the rest of the game will be unplayable if you do. And what's even worse is that if you save the game at this final boss fight, you're fucked. You're stuck in this room forever with no way out. You just gotta go through the whole damn game again, and all that time invested gets thrown in the gutter. I mean, why would they do that? It's a lot less gratifying the second time around. By then it's just a speed run, nothing's a surprise anymore, and you don't have the patience to be sneaky. Is this just supposed to be some sort of funny joke or mean plot twist? Fuck! Speaking of twists, Metal Gear 1 is way more inhibited about it than every other game in the series. If you don't already know from the backstory of pretty much every other game in the series, Big Boss is your helper buddy until he betrays you in the end. Yup, mind-blowing change of role right there. It's a twist that's hinted at for a good while before the reveal, and it isn't a particularly bold trope. Hell, it happened lots of times in real life during the Cold War. Towards the end, the big boss breaks the 4th wall to tell you to turn off your MSX and stop playing the game, which must have been pretty creepy at the time, but it's still downright tame compared to the shit that later games get up to.
I need scissors. 61.
So Big Boss himself is the leader of Outer Heaven, a fortress nation, whatever that is, that just plopped onto the ground out of nowhere, because that's how nationalism works. He kidnaps Dr. Petrovich, a weapons scientist, and forces him to complete the development of Metal Gear as a portable nuclear weapon silo. He also somehow maintains his position as a superior in the US Army who's in command of Foxhound, the super duper elite Black Ops unit that your dude's a part of. Gray Fox gets sent in to investigate, ends up getting captured. So Solid Snake gets sent in to investigate that, and ends up getting captured. You break out, rescue the Fox and the scientists, and eventually learn that the big boss was the big bad all along. At the end of the game, he reveals himself and is like, "Mwahaha, it was me all along, I was using you to fool the world, now die." The self-destruct sequence triggers, and out of nowhere, Diane professes her love for you over the radio.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
You escape just in time while the entire nation of Outer Heaven blows up. You get a one-liner news headline, and then it's the end. As progressive an action game as Metal Gear was, it was still an 80s Japanese action game. All this backstory about Big Boss being a morally gray trans-nationalist mercenary leader wasn't written yet, and the game was more objective-driven than story-driven. Big Boss doesn't have a real motive or any redeeming qualities, he's just a villain, even though the prequels contradict his role here. These are legit plot holes. They get filled in later, but they were the product of an 80s action game whose producers weren't breaking their backs to fully flesh out. It's called story segregation, and it's kind of like a certain other prequel heavy media franchise that went far out of its way to flesh out a character that was easily plopped off 30 years ago. So Big Boss gets offed fairly quickly and painlessly. Gray Fox just kinda disappears in a game logic way after his screen resets and the plot forgets about him. The Petrovich guy and the entirety of Outer Heaven's population presumably blow up but are also left in the air for Next Time. And Next Time doesn't waste any time exploiting these plot holes. The whole series is a mess of spy fiction, plot twists, and retroactive continuity that's tangled up worse than the cables in the back of my computer. And that's half the fun of them. They're not bad plot twists, they're ridiculous, yeah, but they're not hackneyed. Plot twists are a characteristic of this series. They might as well be bullet points on the back of the box. But for now, I'm gonna start keeping track of them with this timeline. Baby steps. Sure, the story's simple and to the point, but it didn't really need to be anything else. Bloating up disk size with story text was a real issue back then, and the game was more about experimenting with action game conventions than anything else. The sales of the NES port arguably did more to push it as a franchise, since Kojima's own Metal Gear sequel was a response to that. Compared to the rest of the series, the first game is so straightforward that it's almost anachronistic, but for that glorious first half, it successfully establishes the mechanics and tropes of an entire genre. It's a brainier and quieter alternative to other action games, and at least attempts a plot twist in cinematic style. You're this unrealistically competent rookie who confronts the evil within, blows up the bad guy, and, gets the girl, kinda? You also walk away from an explosion in the end in slow motion. If Kojima was also trying to gamify his love for cheesy war movies, he somehow managed that one too. The first Metal Gear game was the result of twisting around established ideas to fit outdated hardware, and it would take a couple more attempts to really develop a style and formula behind the series. But for the first few hours, its foundation is so solid that it plays almost like a demake of the Solid games. But development fatigue must have set in, because soon enough there's a good deal of unfulfilled potential that leaves room for Next Time. And oh god, would there ever be a Next Time. The first game is solid enough, but just one installment later things really begin to get interesting. We'll find out what happens in that one soon, but for now, just know that things are gonna get stupid.